The 748 watts of 12,500-volt overhead distribution conductor that came down across the cattle gate of the Bridger Pines Estates Community Pavilion at 4:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in mid-December, in -12-degree Montana cold, under a clear black sky in the Gallatin Valley northwest of Bozeman, was severed by a hired arborist named Wyatt Marshall on the cash instruction of the HOA president of Bridger Pines, a woman in a turquoise quilted Patagonia parka named Tori Princefield. The line carried the entire residential service for the 84 homes of Bridger Pines Estates, plus the 71 rural connections of my company Blackwell Valley Electric, plus the 342 feet of heated stockwater trough my late father Hugh Blackwell had installed for the Marshall family ranch in 1971. By 4:18 a.m., every house in Bridger Pines was cold and dark. By 5:14 a.m., the first pipe burst in the basement of a 6,000-square-foot stone and cedar custom home at the eastern end of Hidden Pines Drive. By 6:14 a.m., Tori Princefield was on the phone to Northwestern Energy's 24-hour outage line, demanding immediate restoration of the line her own contractor had cut 3 hours earlier on her own personal cash instruction. The Northwestern dispatcher, a woman in Butte named Bree Halstead, who had been my classmate at Montana State in 1981, listened for 2 minutes, asked Mrs. Princefield to spell her address, looked up the service grid on her screen, and said in the careful Butte dispatcher's voice she had been using since 1992, "Ma'am, Northwestern does not own that distribution feeder. The line that serves your home is owned and operated by Blackwell Valley Electric. You need to call Mr. Duncan Blackwell. His emergency number is on the bottom of your monthly bill." I came back to the family ranch in Gallatin County, Montana, in the spring of 2022, 8 months after my wife Madeline, Maddie, to everyone who had ever known her, died of pancreatic cancer on a Sunday morning in August of 2021 at our small house in Helena, with my hand on her wrist and our daughter Hadley asleep in the rocking chair beside the bed. Maddie was 62. We had been married for 39 years. She had been a public defender investigator for the state of Montana for 31 years. She had been, in the words of her funeral eulogy that our son Casey wrote and delivered on a Tuesday afternoon in August at the small Methodist church in Helena, the bravest woman in our family and the most patient public servant in the state of Montana. I am Duncan Blackwell, 65 years old, born in Bozeman, Montana, in March of 1959 to the founder and original operator of Blackwell Valley Electric, a private rural electric distribution company my father Hugh Blackwell incorporated under Montana state law on a Friday afternoon in May of 1969 in the law office of Cyril Wexler on Main Street in Bozeman. I am also a 1981 electrical engineering graduate of Montana State University, a 1981 to 2018 career employee of Northwestern Energy, the regional investor-owned utility that serves most of western Montana, and the second-generation owner-operator of Blackwell Valley Electric since the day my father Hugh died at 93 years old, on the front porch of the ranch house in May of 2018. Blackwell Valley Electric is, by the count of the Montana Public Service Commission, as of January 1st of this year, the smallest private electric distribution utility regulated by the state of Montana. We serve 71 rural residential connections, 16 agricultural connections, and 1 single bulk power purchase agreement with the Bridger Pines Estates Homeowners Association, which provides retail electric service through our distribution feeder to all 84 homes of the Bridger Pines subdivision. We operate a single small substation built by my father Hugh in 1969, the Blackwell Valley Substation, on the east edge of the original 2,000-acre Blackwell family ranch, which has been deeded to the Blackwell family by federal homestead patent since 1881. The substation steps wholesale 69 kilovolt power down from the Northwestern Energy transmission line that crosses the ranch under an easement my grandfather, Brennan Blackwell, signed with the Montana Power Company in 1937, and distributes that power as residential-grade 12.5 kilovolt three-phase service across 31 miles of overhead distribution conductor and approximately 14 miles of buried tap lines. Hugh Blackwell built the substation in 1969 because the Montana Power Company had refused, after 11 years of letters, petitions, and one personal trip Hugh had made to the company's Butte headquarters in 1965, to extend residential service to the Blackwell Valley side of the Bridger Range. Hugh was 28 years old. He had a master's degree in electrical engineering from Montana State, a fresh wife named Esme, who would later be my mother, and the entire mineral inheritance from his late father, Brennan Blackwell, that he was willing to spend on the project. He hired a former Bonneville Power Administration substation engineer out of Portland to consult on the design. He pulled the construction permits with the Gallatin County electrical inspector personally. He hired a Bozeman construction crew. He owned and operated the substation himself from May of 1969 until May of 2018. He never raised a residential rate by more than the Montana Consumer Price Index in any year of those 49 years. He never disconnected a customer for non-payment. He never billed late fees. He never sued a contractor. He died on the front porch of the ranch house on May 14, 2018, at 93 years old, with the substation operating, every customer in service, and a handwritten note in his shirt pocket that read, "Duncan, take care of the lines. The people pay your bills with their paychecks." I had been Hugh's full-time deputy operator at Blackwell Valley Electric since 1985, in addition to my day job at Northwestern Energy, where I was a senior distribution engineer for the Bozeman district. I took over the company formally in May of 2018, the week of Hugh's funeral. I have operated it continuously since. I retired from Northwestern Energy in November of 2018 to focus on Blackwell Valley full-time. Maddie and I had been planning to move from Helena to the ranch in the spring of 2022. Maddie did not make the spring of 2022. She made it to the spring of 2021, when we drove the truck up to the ranch house on a Saturday afternoon in April and walked the eastern fence line of the family pasture for the last time together. Our son Casey is 36. He is the senior locomotive electrician for Montana Rail Link at the BNSF repair shop in Missoula. He is married to a high school art teacher named Reagan. They have a daughter named Annalise, who is 4 years old, and a son named Riley, who is 6. Our daughter Hadley is 33. She is a small animal veterinarian at Yellowstone Veterinary Clinic in Bozeman. She is single. She lives in a small apartment above the clinic. She drives up to the ranch most second weekends of the month with her shepherd mix dog named Boots. Maddie had grown up in Anaconda, Montana, in the 1960s, the daughter of an Anaconda Company smelter worker and a librarian. She had a degree in social work from Montana State and a master's in criminal justice administration from the University of Montana. She had spent the first 10 years of her career as a juvenile probation officer in Helena, and the last 21 as the lead investigator for the Montana State Office of the Public Defender, working felony defense cases across 13 rural counties. She had been awarded the Montana Bar Association's Public Service Award in 2017 and had been profiled in the Helena Independent Record on her retirement in March of 2021, 2 months before her diagnosis. She had taken her retirement in part because she had been planning, with me, to move to the ranch and to put 2 rocking chairs on the porch facing the Bridger Range. She did not make it to the ranch as a resident. The 2 rocking chairs are on the porch. I sit in the right one. I leave the left one empty. Bridger Pines Estates was built between 1976 and 1979 by an out-of-state developer named Camden Fry of Denver, Colorado, who had bought a 1,200-acre former Marshall family ranch tract immediately west of our ranch in 1975 for $240,000 after Old Man Marshall died and his 3 sons sold the family land to clear estate debts. Camden Fry subdivided the tract into 84 lots, ranging from 6 to 14 acres each, marketed at prices between $48,000 and $120,000 to retiring Pacific Northwest and California buyers who wanted Montana ranch frontage without owning a Montana ranch. Bridger Pines Estates sold out by 1981. The original developer disappeared into the Colorado housing market in 1982. The subdivision has been governed by a homeowners association of varying competence since 1983. The Bridger Pines Estates HOA's electricity has been supplied by Blackwell Valley Electric on the same 12.5 kilovolt distribution feeder my father built in 1969, since the first house at Bridger Pines was occupied in May of 1976. The wholesale power purchase agreement between Blackwell Valley Electric and Bridger Pines Estates HOA was executed on March 14, 1976, by my father Hugh Blackwell as operator, and by Camden Fry as developer agent for the HOA to be formed, in the same law office of Cyril Wexler on Main Street in Bozeman, where Blackwell Valley Electric itself had been incorporated 7 years earlier. The agreement was a 27-page document I had personally helped Cyril Wexler draft when I was a 16-year-old summer intern at his office, doing typing and filing work for $2 an hour. Section 11.4 of the agreement, on page 19, contained a 5-paragraph material breach acceleration clause that I had personally negotiated language for under Cyril's supervision, and that my father Hugh had reviewed and approved in pencil on Cyril's library table on a Tuesday afternoon in late February of 1976. Section 11.4 said, in summary, that the HOA was obligated to maintain vegetation clearance under the distribution feeder, to refrain from any interference with the lines or with Blackwell Valley Electric's access to them, to indemnify Blackwell Valley Electric against any damage to the lines caused by the HOA or its agents, and to assume full restoration cost in the event of any sabotage, vandalism, or unauthorized interference. The clause also gave Blackwell Valley Electric the right, upon 30 days written notice of material breach and absent cure within that period, to suspend or terminate service to the HOA. The breach could be cured by full restoration payment, public apology, removal of the offending HOA officer from any position of authority, and a written ratification by 2/3 of the HOA membership that the HOA recognize Blackwell Valley Electric's easement and infrastructure rights in perpetuity. In 48 years of operation under that agreement, Section 11.4 had never been invoked. The Bridger Pines HOA had, across 48 years and 7 HOA presidents, paid its bulk power bill on time every month, maintained the vegetation under the lines, called Blackwell Valley promptly when a tree limb fell on a line during a windstorm, and conducted itself, in every dealing with my father and with me, as a responsible cooperating party to a long-running infrastructure arrangement. Tory Princefield became the president of the Bridger Pines Estates Homeowners Association in March of 2020 after a contested election against the incumbent, a retired Bozeman pediatrician named Sonia Vanderpool, who had been HOA president since 2013, and who had personally co-signed Blackwell Valley Electric's annual rate increases with Cyril Wexler at his Bozeman law office every year of her presidency. Sonia Vanderpool lost the 2020 election by 7 votes to Tory Princefield, on a platform Tory had run under the campaign slogan, "Restoring the Bridger Pines Aesthetic." The Bridger Pines aesthetic Tory intended to restore included, prominently, the removal of what she described in her campaign newsletter as the ugly overhead power lines, marring our community viewshed of the Bridger Range. The overhead power lines marring the Bridger Pines viewshed of the Bridger Range were the 8,400 feet of 12.5 kilovolt distribution conductor on 12 40-foot wooden poles that my father Hugh had installed in 1976 to feed the subdivision, on the easement Camden Fry had granted Blackwell Valley Electric in the 1976 power supply agreement. Across what was then a hay meadow and is now a Bridger Pines common area pavilion lawn, with a stone fire pit and 3 picnic shelters Tory's HOA had installed in 2022. Tory had been campaigning since her election to either bury those lines underground at HOA expense, an estimated $490,000 in 2023 estimates, or remove them entirely on the unstated assumption that Northwestern Energy would simply extend a new service feeder from the other direction, at no cost to the subdivision. Neither option, when I had reviewed them with Tory across 3 formal Bridger Pines HOA board meetings in 2021, 2022, and 2023, had been economically or operationally feasible. The first option would have required HOA members to vote a special assessment averaging $5,800 per household. The second option would have required Northwestern Energy to build approximately 6 miles of new distribution feeder at a cost of $1.8 million, paid by Northwestern ratepayers across the entire western Montana service territory, with no benefit to anyone other than the Bridger Pines HOA, in violation of the Montana PSC's no cross-subsidy doctrine. Tory had not accepted either rejection. She had filed formal complaints with the Montana Public Service Commission in 2021, 2022, and 2023. All 3 complaints had been dismissed on the merits. The 2021 complaint alleged Blackwell Valley Electric was operating without proper regulatory authority, which the PSC dismissed within 31 days on the basis that Blackwell Valley Electric had held continuous Montana PSC certification under PSC docket 1969-D-0418 since May of 1969. The 2022 complaint alleged the substation was operating outside permitted hours, a category of allegation that does not exist in Montana utility regulation. The PSC dismissed it on the basis that electric utilities operate 24 hours a day by definition. The 2023 complaint alleged the lines were creating electromagnetic frequency health hazards and submitted, as supporting evidence, 3 printouts from a Facebook group called Bridger Pines Concerned Citizens that Tori had founded and administered herself. The PSC dismissed it on the basis that the printouts were not evidence and that the EMF claims had been refuted by every peer-reviewed scientific body that had ever examined them. She had filed a civil complaint in Gallatin County District Court in early 2024, seeking declaratory relief that the 1976 easement was stale and unenforceable. The case had been dismissed at the motion to dismiss stage by Judge Tabitha Stillwell in June of 2024 on the basis that the easement was perpetual, recorded, and clear on its face. Judge Stillwell, in her written dismissal order, had added an unusual paragraph at the end, noting that the plaintiff's complaint demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of both Montana easement law and the operational realities of rural electric service, and recommending that the plaintiff consult with qualified counsel before filing any further such matters in this court. In August of 2024, Tori had begun privately contacting tree service contractors in the Bozeman area to discuss vegetation management options on the Bridger Pines common area. The first 3 contractors she contacted had declined the work after reviewing the actual lines on site and recognizing they were active 12.5 kilovolt distribution feeders that required specialized line clearance training to approach within 10 feet. The 4th contractor she contacted, a young man named Wyatt Marshall, 26 years old, who operated a small, independent tree service business out of the back of his pickup truck, and who had no power line safety training of any kind, accepted the work for a cash payment of $4,200 on the morning of Monday, December 16, 2024. Wyatt Marshall was the youngest grandson of the original Marshall family, whose ranch had been sold to Camden Fry in 1975 to build the Bridger Pines subdivision. Wyatt did not know that. Wyatt had grown up in Belgrade, the son of the Marshall family member who had moved into town in the 1990s after the family ranch was gone. Wyatt also did not know that the line he was being paid $4,200 to cut was the same line my father Hugh had run to his grandfather's stock water trough in 1971, 342 feet of which had survived as a community pavilion heritage installation on the Bridger Pines lawn that Tori Princefield had not, in 5 years of presidency, ever asked about. Tori Princefield met Wyatt Marshall at the Bozeman Co-op coffee shop on the corner of Main and Tracy at 8:14 a.m. on Monday, December 16th, in a turquoise quilted Patagonia parka and a pair of leather-trimmed Sorel boots. She had bought him a black coffee. She had spread on the small 2-top table a hand-sketched diagram of the Bridger Pines common area with 3 orange X's marking the lines she wanted cut. She had counted out 42 $100 bills from a leather envelope, in 2 stacks of 20 and 1 stack of 2, and had pushed them across the table to Wyatt under the diagram. She had said, in language Wyatt would later quote in his statement to Sheriff Drugovich's deputy at 5:47 a.m. on Tuesday, December 17th, "Wyatt, these lines need to come down by morning. Cash today. No paperwork. No follow-up. Do you understand what I am asking?" Wyatt had said, "Yes, ma'am." The Bozeman Co-op had 3 security cameras pointed at the coffee shop seating area. The cameras recorded the entire conversation. They recorded the diagram. They recorded the cash count. They recorded Wyatt putting the diagram and the cash in his Carhartt jacket. The co-op's general manager, a woman named Heidi Foreman, who had been a Bozeman Natural Foods Cooperative employee since 1991, would later, by 11:14 a.m. on Tuesday morning, pull the security footage at Sheriff Drugovich's request and have it on a USB drive, ready for pickup at her office by 11:47 a.m. Heidi Foreman had been Maddie's college roommate at Montana State in 1981. He cut the line at 4:14 a.m. on Tuesday, December 17th, on a clear black sky at -12 degrees Fahrenheit, with the headlights of his pickup truck pointed at the pole and a chainsaw on a fiberglass extension pole that he had borrowed without permission from his father's garage in Belgrade the night before. The line came down across the cattle gate of the Bridger Pines Common Area Pavilion in a single quiet sweep of orange sparks that the substation's automatic protective relay registered at 4:14 and 17 seconds. The substation's automatic recloser tried to restore the line 3 times across the next 90 seconds. On each attempt, the protective relay tripped the breaker again. After the third attempt, per the substation's design protocol, the recloser locked out and waited for a human operator to manually inspect and reset. The human operator on call for Blackwell Valley Electric on the morning of December 17, 2024, was me. My phone alarm sounded at 4:15:14. I'm on the bedside table in the ranch house. I had been on call every night, by personal habit, since my father died in 2018. I sat up. I read the substation alert on the screen. The alert was a Class C lockout on Feeder 2, the Bridger Pines feeder. Class C lockouts at -12 degrees in December meant either a tree on the line or a deliberate cut. The substation's GPS log showed the breaker had tripped at 3 locations across a quarter-mile section between Pole 8 and Pole 14, the section that crossed the Bridger Pines Common Area Pavilion. I called my line crew foreman Linus Olson at 4:18 a.m. Linus answered on the second ring. He had been a Blackwell Valley line crewman since 1991. He had taken over the foreman role from my father in 2014. He was 64 years old. He lived 11 minutes from the ranch in a small house in Manhattan, Montana. I said, "Linus, Feeder 2, 3 locations, Pole 8 to Pole 14, Bridger Pines." Linus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Duncan, that section runs across the HOA pavilion. Did you see the weather report on Friday?" I said, "Linus, the wind was nothing, 3 miles an hour out of the west, no precipitation since Sunday." Linus said, "Duncan, the trees did not bring this line down." I said, "Linus, roll the crew. I'll meet you at the substation in 15 minutes. We were at the substation by 4:34 a.m. The substation's outdoor security camera, which my father had installed in 1989 and which I had upgraded in 2019 to a Riolink 4K system on a battery backup, had captured the entire substation perimeter overnight. We pulled the line monitoring video from the pole-mounted cameras my company had installed across the Bridger Pines feeder section in 2022, after a windstorm had brought down a section we had spent 4 days repairing. The pole cameras were on a separate battery system from the line itself. They had been recording throughout the outage. At 4:11:03 a.m. on Tuesday, December 17th, a 2015 Chevy Silverado pickup truck with a Montana license plate I would later confirm was registered to Wyatt Marshall of Belgrade, had pulled into the Bridger Pines Pavilion access road with its headlights off. The driver had gotten out in a Carhartt jacket and a watch cap. He had walked to the base of Pole 11. He had set up a fiberglass extension chainsaw on his shoulder. At 4:14:10 a.m., he had cut the primary distribution conductor at Pole 11. At 4:14:48 a.m., he had cut a second section at Pole 13. At 4:15:32 a.m., as the protective relay was completing its lockout sequence, he had cut a third section at Pole 9. The footage was clear enough to use as a yearbook photograph. The young man had not been wearing a face covering. He had not been wearing safety equipment. He had cut 3 sections of energized 12.5 kilovolt distribution conductor with a fiberglass extension pole chainsaw at -12 degrees in the dark, on an HOA president's cash instruction. He was, in the legal language of Section 11.4 of the 1976 Power Supply Agreement, the agent of the HOA. Tory Princefield had, by direct cash payment on the morning of December 16th, made him so. I called Bree Halstead at the Northwestern Energy Dispatch Center in Butte at 4:42 a.m. Bree had been my classmate at Montana State in 1981. I told her, in the careful operator's language we both knew, that Blackwell Valley Electric had a Class C lockout on Feeder 2 due to documented third-party sabotage, and that if she received any calls about Bridger Pines estates being out of power, she should refer the callers directly to me. Bree said, "Duncan, "How many homes?" I said, "Bree, 84. She said, "Duncan, it's -12. The pipes will start at 60 minutes. I said, "Bree, the pipes will start at 60 minutes. I am calling the HOA president now." I did not call the HOA president. I called Sheriff Tarquin Drugovich of the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office. I had been on Sheriff Drugovich's tax roll and emergency contact list as the operator of a regulated utility in his county for 4 years. He answered his personal cell phone at 4:48 a.m. I gave him a brief summary, the substation video file location, and the license plate of the Chevy Silverado. Sheriff Drugovich said one sentence. "Duncan, I'll have a deputy at Wyatt Marshall's address in Belgrade by 5:30. Tell your crew to stay off the lines until my deputy clears the scene." I said, "Tarquin, understood." I called Linus back. I told him to hold the crew at the substation until further notice. I told him to start the formal restoration estimate package. I asked him to wake Cyril Wexler's son, Marsden Wexler, who had taken over Cyril's Bozeman law practice in 2008 and who had been Blackwell Valley Electric's corporate counsel since. By 4:58 a.m., the substation control room had its overhead fluorescents on, and the line crew was assembled around the work table where my father, Hugh, had drawn the original Bridger Pines feeder layout in pencil in February of 1976. Linus had pulled the printed feeder map. Patrick Halverson, who had driven over from his house in Belgrade in 14 minutes flat, was at the coffee pot. Eduardo Mendoza, who was supposed to be on vacation visiting his daughter in Salt Lake City, but who had been called by Linus at 4:33 a.m. and had been on the road within 20 minutes, was halfway up Interstate 15 with his headlights on and his Carhartt jacket buttoned. He would be at the substation by 7 a.m. I stood at the work table and looked at the pencil layout my father had drawn 48 years earlier. The penciled handwriting was Hugh Blackwell's, the kind of careful surveyor's handwriting he had been using on field notes since 1948. The feeder map showed every pole, every transformer, every drop, every transition. It also showed, on the southwest margin in Hugh's quiet pencil, a handwritten note dated February 22, 1976, that read, Section 11.4, Material Breach Acceleration, D's language, approved, HB. D was me. I had been 16 years old. The note was the only acknowledgement my father had ever made, in any document I had ever found in any of his files, that the clause I had drafted as a kid would, decades from then, do exactly what we had built it to do. I had not seen the note until 4:58 a.m. on Tuesday, December 17, 2024. I stood at the work table for a long minute. I did not say anything to the crew. The crew did not need me to say anything. Linus, Patrick, and the 2 younger linemen who had reported by 4:50, Sigrid Lingstad, 28, and her cousin Knut Lingstad, 31, both second-generation Blackwell Valley line crew, had been doing this kind of cold morning work all of their adult lives. They poured coffee. They studied the feeder map. They waited. I called Cyril Wexler's son, Marsden, at 5:02 a.m. Marsden Wexler answered his home phone at 5:03 a.m. I told him what had happened. I told him I intended to invoke Section 11.4. He said, in the careful Bozeman attorney's voice his father had taught him, "Duncan, I will be at the substation by 7 a.m. I will have the notice of material breach drafted by 9. I will have it served on Tory Princefield personally by Sheriff Drugovich's office by noon. I will have a parallel referral to the Gallatin County District Attorney by 1 p.m. for criminal sabotage charges, and a parallel referral to the Montana Public Service Commission by 2 p.m. for sanction under PSC Rule 38.5.106. I said, "Marsden, send the notice." It was 5:14 a.m. By 5:14 a.m., the 84 homes of Bridger Pines Estates had been without power for exactly 1 hour. The first pipe at the eastern end of Hidden Pines Drive had just burst. By 6:14 a.m., Tory Princefield was on the phone to Northwestern Energy's 24-hour outage line. By 6:18 a.m., Bree Halstead had referred Tory Princefield to me. By 6:42 a.m., Tory Princefield had called me on my cell phone. She did not introduce herself. She said, in the voice of a woman who had just learned at 6:18 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that the power line she had paid $4,200 to cut at 4:14 a.m. was not, as she had believed, an irrelevant piece of Northwestern Energy backup infrastructure, but rather the primary distribution feeder for her own house. "Mr. Blackwell, there has been a there has been a vegetation incident at the Bridger Pines common area. The community is without power. It is 12 below. We need immediate restoration. I said, Mrs. Princefield, I am aware of the vegetation incident. The vegetation incident was not vegetation. It was 3 deliberate cuts to my distribution feeder by a contractor named Wyatt Marshall, who was paid $4,200 in cash by you on Monday morning at the Bozeman Co-op coffee shop at 8:14 a.m. The transaction was captured on the co-op's security cameras. Sheriff Drugovich's deputy is at Mr. Marshall's address in Belgrade right now. Mr. Marshall has, at this moment, already confirmed the cash transaction and the cash source by signed statement. There was a very long silence on the line. Tory Princefield said, Mr. Blackwell, there has been a misunderstanding. We need power restored immediately. The community is in danger. I am willing to discuss any reasonable resolution. I said, Mrs. Princefield, the resolution under Section 11.4 of the 1976 Power Supply Agreement between Bridger Pines Estates and Blackwell Valley Electric is full restoration cost paid by your HOA, a public apology, your personal removal from the HOA presidency, and a 2/3 membership ratification of the agreement's easement and infrastructure provisions in perpetuity. The full restoration cost estimate from my line foreman, completed at 6:14 a.m. this morning, is $142,000. The restoration timeline, under standard winter conditions, is 72 hours. My company will not be repairing the line until the breach is cured. I would suggest you call your attorney, your insurance carrier, and your HOA board, in that order, and that you call them immediately. Have a good morning. I hung up. It was 6:51 a.m. The sun was still an hour from coming up over the Bridger Range. The temperature on my kitchen thermometer was -14. Linus Olson drove up to the ranch house at 6:58 a.m. with a thermos of strong coffee in one hand and a printed Bridger Pines feeder map under his arm. He sat across the kitchen table from me without taking off his Carhartt jacket. He said, Duncan, the crew is at the substation. They have the propane heaters on. They have the line truck warmed up. They are ready to roll the moment Marsden gives us the green light. The estimated restoration time at -12 is 72 to 96 hours under controlled conditions. The cost estimate I'm finalizing now is $142,000 even, plus standby crew overtime if we go past Thursday. I said, Linus, Marsden is on his way. He said, Duncan, are you sure about Section 11.4? I said, Linus, your daddy installed half this feeder with my daddy in 1976. Are you sure you'd run it any other way? Linus thought about that for one long minute. Then he said, Duncan, I'd run it exactly the way Hugh would have. He'd have invoked Section 11.4 by 4:42 a.m. He'd have had Cyril at the substation by 6:30. He'd have had the notice on Tory's door by 8. He'd have repaired the feeder when the HOA cured the breach, and not 1 minute before. I said, Linus, that's where we are. He drank his coffee. He pulled on his hat. He went back out to the substation. By 7 a.m., Marsden Wexler was at the substation with a 31-page notice of material breach in a sealed envelope addressed to Tory Princefield. Sheriff Drugovich himself rode up the gravel road to the Princefield residence at 8:01 a.m. in his marked Tahoe, with his deputy Brendan Pulaski in the passenger seat, and a copy of the Bozeman Co-op security footage on his iPad. The Princefield house, 6,400 square feet of board and batten and stacked stone with a 4-bay garage and a heated swimming pool covered for the winter, sat at the highest point of Hidden Pines Drive. The driveway was already dusted with the kind of fine, glittering snow that the Bridger Range generates in December at -12 degrees. The Princefields' 3 vehicles, Tory's white Cadillac Escalade, Brett's gray Audi A6, and a red rental Suburban the visiting children had picked up at Gallatin Field on Sunday, were all in the driveway and all blanketed in a thin layer of newly settled cold air condensation that turned to frost on contact with the warm metal. The interior of the house was dark. Sheriff Drugovich knocked on the front door at 8:03 a.m. Brett Princefield answered in a flannel robe over a sweater, with a battery-powered headlamp pulled awkwardly across his forehead. He had the haggard look of a man who had been awakened at 5:30 by his wife's profanity, who had spent 2.5 hours trying to relight a propane fireplace that did not have a manual ignition, and who had not yet been told by his wife exactly what she had done at the Bozeman Co-op on Monday morning at 8:14. Sheriff Drugovich said, in the careful Gallatin County Sheriff's voice he had been using on rural Montana ranchers and weekend second homeowners alike since 1996, "Mr. Princefield, I need to speak with Mrs. Princefield. May I come in?" Brett looked at Sheriff Drugovich. He looked at Deputy Pulaski. He looked at the notice of material breach in Sheriff Drugovich's left hand. He said, "Sheriff, what did she do?" Sheriff Drugovich said, "Mr. Princefield, she'll need to explain that herself." By 8:14 a.m., Sheriff Drugovich's deputy had personally served the notice on Tori at her Bridger Pines residence, in the doorway, with no electricity, in the dark, in front of her shivering husband and 2 adult children who were visiting from Seattle for the Christmas holiday. By 9:47 a.m., the Bridger Pines HOA board had called an emergency telephonic meeting. By 11:14 a.m., the board had voted 6-1, Tori abstaining, to remove Tori Princefield from the presidency and to authorize the HOA's vice president, a retired Bozeman accountant named Whitaker Ortman, to negotiate a settlement of the Section 11.4 breach with Blackwell Valley Electric. Sonia Vanderpool, the retired Bozeman pediatrician who had been the HOA's last competent president and who had been deposed by Tori in the 2020 election, was at the emergency board meeting by telephone from her son's house in Spokane, where she had been spending Christmas with her grandchildren. Sonia had not held an HOA office for almost 5 years. She was 68 years old and had retired from medical practice in 2018. When the board called her in at 10:14 a.m. to seek her counsel as the longest-serving former president, she spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. She said on the call, "Board members, I worked with Hugh Blackwell from 2013 to 2020. I worked with Duncan Blackwell from 2018 to 2020. I have personally read the 1976 power supply agreement. I have personally watched the Blackwell family invoke not a single material breach acceleration across the entirety of my presidency, despite Tori filing 3 separate PSC complaints during my final year. The Blackwells have been the most patient, professional, and conscientious infrastructure operators I have ever worked with in any capacity in my 41-year career in this state. Mrs. Princefield has been telling you for 5 years that they are unreasonable. They are not unreasonable. They are restrained. They are restrained no longer. Your job this morning is to cure the breach. Your job, by Friday, is to elect a new president and to ratify the easement. Your job, by spring, is to remember that you are very lucky we still have a Blackwell at the substation." The board voted 6-1, Tori abstaining, at 10:47 a.m. Whitaker Ortman called Marsden Wexler at 11:18 a.m. The settlement was negotiated across 31 minutes on a single conference call. The HOA agreed to pay the full restoration cost of $142,000 from its reserve fund, to issue a written apology to Blackwell Valley Electric and to the Blackwell family, to ratify the 1976 easement by 2/3 membership vote at an emergency Saturday meeting, and to indemnify Blackwell Valley Electric against any claims arising from Tori Princefield's individual conduct. Marsden accepted the settlement on my behalf at 11:51 a.m. The HOA wired the restoration payment from the HOA reserve fund at 1:14 p.m. that Tuesday afternoon. By 2 p.m., Linus and the line crew were at the cut. The repair took the rest of Tuesday, all of Wednesday, and most of Thursday morning in continuous -10 to -15 degree cold. Linus's crew worked in 2-hour rotations with hot coffee from a thermos and a propane heater under each pole. Power was restored to Bridger Pines Estates at 11:47 a.m. on Thursday, December 19th, 75 hours and 33 minutes after Wyatt Marshall's first cut. Linus's repair crew worked under conditions that the Montana Occupational Safety and Health Administration would later, in a March of 2025 field report, classify as exemplary cold weather utility restoration practice. The crew rotated every 90 minutes between the line and the propane heated equipment trailer. Linus served them hot chocolate from a thermos every rotation. Casey drove down from Missoula on Wednesday morning at 6 a.m. and worked the bucket truck rotation himself for the next 20 hours, alongside men he had grown up calling Uncle Linus, Uncle Eduardo, and Uncle Patrick, the latter being Patrick Halverson, 62, my father's first apprentice, and the man who had taught me how to climb a 40-foot wooden pole in 1976 when I was 16 years old. Hadley brought hot homemade pasties down from Bozeman every afternoon from the Pasty Wagon food truck at the corner of Main and Tracy, where the owner, a Welsh-American baker named Bronwyn Brewer, had refused all of Hadley's offered payment after Hadley had explained, on her first trip in on Tuesday afternoon, what crew the pasties were for. By the time power was restored, 41 homes in Bridger Pines Estates had documented frozen pipe damage ranging from $3,000 to $140,000 per home. The total HOA member damage came to approximately $3.1 million. The HOA's insurance carrier denied all claims on the grounds that the damage had been caused by the deliberate sabotage of the HOA president, which was excluded under the HOA's master liability policy. Individual homeowners with personal property coverage were partially reimbursed. Their carriers were left to subrogate against Tory Princefield personally and against the HOA Reserve Fund. Tory Princefield was indicted by a Gallatin County grand jury on January 14, 2025, on 6 state counts: conspiracy to commit criminal mischief in the first degree, reckless endangerment, criminal endangerment in the first degree, intimidation of a public utility, and theft by deception of HOA funds. She pleaded out in May to 4 counts. She drew 34 months in Montana State Correctional, with the last 16 suspended on conditions including full personal restitution of $3.1 million and a permanent ban from any HOA officer position in the state of Montana for the remainder of her life. Wyatt Marshall pleaded to 1 count of criminal mischief and 1 count of conspiracy as a youthful offender. He drew 18 months supervised probation and 600 hours of community service, which he is currently completing as a volunteer line clearance trainee with Blackwell Valley Electric. He started on Monday, March 3rd. He is, as of this writing, a careful and apologetic young man who has learned every safety lesson Linus Olson can teach him. Brett Princefield filed for divorce on January 28th. He moved out of Bridger Pines Estates on February 14th. He sent me a single, handwritten letter in April that said, in 3 sentences, on a single sheet of cream stationery, "Mr. Blackwell, I am very sorry for what my wife did. I was not aware of her actions. I hope your line crew was paid well for working in that cold." The Bridger Pines Estates HOA elected Whitaker Ortman to the permanent presidency at the emergency Saturday meeting on December 21st. The 2/3 easement ratification passed 76-8, with all 8 no votes coming from the small, remaining Princefield faction households, who would, by April of 2025, all have sold their homes and left the subdivision. I used the $142,000 restoration payment in 3 ways. The first $110,000 went into a substation upgrade my father had been deferring since 2003. Installation of a solar photovoltaic auxiliary input that allows Blackwell Valley Electric to feed up to 15% of its peak load from a fixed-tilt 300-kilowatt solar array I installed on the south-facing slope behind the original 1969 substation, completed in August of 2025. The solar array was designed by Hadley's high school physics teacher, a man named Cornelius Tabor, who had taught at Bozeman High since 1992, and who had moved into rural electric solar design as a side practice in 2017. He charged Blackwell Valley Electric his at-cost rate of $31,000 for the design work. The construction was done by a crew out of Belgrade, whose foreman, a Mexican-American journeyman lineman named Eduardo Mendoza, had been a 1991 apprentice under my father, Hugh. The array generates approximately 440 megawatt-hours per year, which is enough to power 36 average Montana homes, and which reduces Blackwell Valley Electric's wholesale purchase obligation from Northwestern Energy by approximately $17,000 annually. The next $25,000 went into a small community solar credit program available to any Blackwell Valley Electric residential customer at or below the Gallatin County low-income threshold, providing a flat 15% annual reduction on monthly bills. The first 31 households enrolled by November of 2025. The remaining $7,000 went into a small, interpretive plaque installed at the corner of the substation's perimeter fence on the public Blackwell Hollow Road, honoring my father Hugh Blackwell as the founder and original operator of Blackwell Valley Electric, with a single dedicatory line at the bottom that my son Casey had written and that I had not seen until the plaque was unveiled on October 14, 2025, the same day Hugh would have turned 100. The line reads, "He built the line so his neighbors could pay their bills with their paychecks." I sit on the porch most evenings with a thermos of coffee. The substation hums quietly on the eastern slope. Linus Olson drives by most mornings on his way to the shop in Manhattan. Hadley brings boots up most second weekends and brings veterinary news from the clinic. Casey and Reagan and the kids come up most third weekends from Missoula. And Annalise, who is now 5, has learned to ask me at the dinner table every Saturday night to tell the substation story one more time. I tell her the version Hugh would have told. I leave out the $4,200 in cash at the Bozeman Co-op. I leave out the -12-degree cold. I tell her instead the story of a 28-year-old electrical engineer in 1969 who decided to build a substation himself because the company in Butte would not extend the lines, and who built it well enough that his son and his granddaughter were still keeping the lights on 56 winters later. The community solar program reached 48 enrolled households by April of 2026. Eduardo Mendoza retired from the Belgrade Line construction firm in May of 2026 and accepted my offer of a part-time position at Blackwell Valley Electric as the senior solar array operator. Wyatt Marshall completed his court-ordered community service in October of 2026. He passed his journeyman lineman exam at Montana State's continuing education program in February of 2027. He is, as of this writing, a 30-year-old apprentice at Linus Olson's crew with a clean record at the Montana PSC, a pickup truck registered to his own name, and a quiet handshake every Friday afternoon with the foreman of the crew that taught him what his grandfather's neighbor's old line had meant. He has, by his own quiet request, never been assigned to work on the Bridger Pines feeder section. Linus respects the request. The Bridger Pines Estates HOA holds an annual Memorial Day potluck at the community pavilion under the rebuilt 12.5 kilovolt distribution line. Whitaker Ortman invited me personally to the first one on May 26, 2025. I accepted. I brought Hadley and Boots. We ate 3 different kinds of pasty Bronwyn Brewer had donated from the pasty wagon. Sonia Vanderpool had baked the Swedish almond cookies on the dessert table. Whitaker's wife Ingrid had brought a venison and mushroom stew. The kids of Bridger Pines ran around the common area lawn beneath the rebuilt line and did not know, by their ages, that anything had ever gone wrong above their heads in December of 2024. Whitaker Ortman walked over to my picnic table at the end of the potluck. He sat down across from me. He set down a small cardstock envelope. He said, "Duncan, the board commissioned a small bronze plaque last fall. We had it cast at a foundry in Spokane. We would like to install it at the base of pole 11. The plaque language was written by Sonia. We would like your approval before we go ahead." I opened the envelope. The plaque language said in 7 lines, "Pole 11, Bridger Pines feeder, Blackwell Valley Electric, installed 1976 by Hugh Blackwell. Severed on December 17, 2024 by our own mistake. Restored on December 19, 2024 by the crew who had always kept it standing. Dedicated in gratitude." I read it twice. I looked at Whitaker. I said, "Whitaker, the plaque language is approved." He said, "Duncan, the board would like to install it on Memorial Day weekend of 2026. I said, "Whitaker, I'll be there." We installed the plaque at the base of pole 11 on May 25, 2026, in front of 47 Bridger Pines households. Sonia Vanderpool read the plaque language aloud. Whitaker Ortman shook my hand. Annalise, who was now 5 years old and who had ridden up from Missoula on her mother Reagan's lap, asked me to read the plaque to her one more time. I did. She nodded the way a 5-year-old nods when she has understood a sentence that adults are taking seriously. She said, "Grandpa, they cut Grandpa Hugh's pole." I said, "Annalise, they did. They are very sorry. They put up a sign so nobody forgets." She thought about it. She said, "Grandpa, that's fair." I said, "Annalise, that's right. If you have ever had an HOA Karen demand the removal of a piece of infrastructure she did not understand was the infrastructure she was using, comment below with your state and what she demanded. Read every one. Subscribe. Next week, a Florida widower, a 1972 Cadillac, and the HOA president who picked the wrong car. She picked the wrong Cadillac.
What Tory Principal did not understand, and what most petty tyrants never understand, is that the man on the other side of the substation perimeter fence was not a quiet rural utility operator. She could intimidate off a piece of infrastructure her own subdivision has been quietly relying on for 48 years. He was a 31-year senior distribution engineer who has personally helped draft a 16-year-old the Section 11.4 material breach clause of the 1976 Power Supply Agreement that governed her HOA's electricity. She thought a tree service contractor with a chainsaw was a strategy. He thought a recorded easement and a 48 years power supply contract were a strategy. The recorded easement wins is always wins, because a 12.5 kilovolt distribution feeder does not get angry, and it does not need to lift its voice. If you have any kind of infrastructure on your property that serves a neighbor, a private water line, a private road, a private power feeder, a private well, pull the original easement document tonight and read the material risk clause. Clause is in there. If this story hit home, drop your own HOA nightmare in the comments, your state, and what they try to cut. Subscribe. Next week, a Florida widower, a 1972 Cadillac, and the HOA president who picked the wrong car. See you on the next one.